Okay, good evening everyone. Good evening. Hope you all have found a good place to sit. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the second lecture in a series of lectures, the Stadssalon Urbain, which is all about art and the city this year. So I'll first introduce myself. I'm Geert van der Meersen. I'm a professor at the Department of Educational Sciences. I mostly work around art education and youth work in the city. And that is indeed how this kind of lecture series kind of originated. So each year, BUCUS, the Brussels Center for Urban Studies, organizes these lectures, and each year a kind of guest curator, so to speak, picks a topic and together with other people in the room from my group, we pick topics, we write the theme, we invite speakers from all over the world to come give a lecture in this series. So a bit about the topic, artful cities. So it starts from the idea that cities are more than just concrete architecture, concrete infrastructure. They're also effective spaces of imagination. And our hypothesis or idea is that artists, creatives have a lot to contribute to this kind of effective and imaginative nature of the city. But of course, art, we're also critical scholars, of course, so art also has an ambivalent position. While it can reveal hidden stories, challenge dominant narratives, we often also see today that it's being used for other purposes, maybe economic purposes, purposes of branding of the city. So we always try to look at it from different perspectives. And I think, well, I'm pretty sure that the speaker of tonight will talk about this double nature of art, and more specifically, well, placemaking. So Cara Courage is, oh, wait, maybe I just have to mention this. There's also a next lecture, sorry, missed the slide. The next lecture is in a month, then Kate Oakley, professor from Edinburgh University, Glasgow University, Glasgow University, will come to speak about creatives in the city and connected to urban policy. But the speaker of tonight, again, too quickly, Cara Courage. So why did we invite Cara? A couple of years ago, we started working on placemaking, and we started seeing this name, Cara Courage, popping up again and again and again. So then you begin to wonder, maybe you should read more of her work, because indeed she's mentioned a lot in the work on placemaking. And in her work, and she will definitely talk about that, she has done a lot to clarify this term of placemaking, which is used in different contexts with different purposes. She has done a lot, create typologies, create different, or talk about different versions of placemaking, but of course at the same time also being very critical about how this term is being used by policymakers, by diverse groups in the city, in city planning, in urban planning. But as if that was not enough, the theoretical work, the academic work, she's also heavily engaged in the practice of placemaking, working together with communities, urban planners, artists, museums, the list goes on and on and on, so to speak. So she also translates that knowledge into practice, to kind of reach for a placemaking that works towards more care, more social justice, more equity when using the art in the city. So I think that's a bit my introduction, so I will give the floor to you, Cara.
Thank you very much for that. It's amazing to be here, and I've met some of you earlier, and all credit to you for turning up on the end of a week on a rainy day to talk about placemaking. And also a thank you from me for listening to me and then hopefully having a conversation with me in English as well. I really appreciate that. So the title of my lecture. I've got notes here as well. I don't want to keep you here all night. This is literally my specialist subject, and I can talk about it for hours and hours and hours. So I'll keep to my notes to keep myself disciplined at the same time. So this title, Does Placemaking Mean Anything? I asked that quite deliberately, and I've been asking that question of myself over the last couple of years as well. Because you see the term absolutely everywhere. It appears in government policy documents. There's, in the UK, certainly a massive turn with our arts, culture, heritage funders jumping on this term as a way to completely restructure how they give their funds out. It's in government strategies, policies, arts organisations are using it. It's increasingly in academic research. It's increasingly in community group, manifestos as well. But I've always wondered, because this term is being used so much, does it actually really carry any substance anymore? Has it become so elastic, so stretched as a meaning that it's actually come to mean nothing at all? But then also, why should this matter? Because placemaking isn't just like a nice idea to make places nicer, as some narratives might have it. It's a really political practice, and it has within it a really inherent radical potential that I think is really important to hold on to. And the radical potential of it is, as a practice in place, is that the community is the expert in that place, and they have to be at the decision-making table of that place. And that's what, in the roots of placemaking, which is another lecture, but that was the thing that diverged, made it diverge from other place-based disciplines, was that real inherent belief in the community as the expert in their place, in their lived experience, and hold on to that as we go through our time together today as well. So, what I want to do today, I want to begin to cut through some of this language, this vagueness of the term, and reframe it a bit. I want to look at how placemaking has been stretched and used, though. I want to explore what happens when we return placemaking to some of its roots. And I want to suggest that placemaking does mean something, but only if we insist on holding it to account. I'm going to give you a quick visual tour, though, to start off, to give you that kind of flavour of what placemaking, or what's attributed as placemaking. So some of the A-lister projects here that are lauded now as placemaking, the High Line in New York, real poster child kind of stuff of this kind of work. There's a whole smorgasbord feast of urban design interventions that when you sort of Google placemaking, this kind of stuff will come up. And pop-up parks and those kind of things. These are also really emblematic of what people think of, put out there as placemaking too. And then there's a real grassroots part of this spectrum that works really at the hyper-local level, and it is really working with the community of the place at the same time. And so together these images really manifest to me the kind of a bit of a sense of like anything and everything that's done in place now gets called placemaking. Anything that's colourful, a bit playful, a bit different from something normative as such, it's been called placemaking. But there's also something in this, if placemaking is everywhere, it's also really hard to pin down what it is. And I was asked a question earlier, like, how do you describe yourself as a placemaker? And it really stumped me, because the question I normally get is, what is placemaking? Because nobody really seems to know, even though this term is really, really common. And there's part of the answer to this lies in this strategic ambiguity of this term of placemaking. It can mean many different things to many different people. In a sense, that's okay. Like the term art has objective and subjective understandings. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. But why should it matter to us here? Because actually that strategic ambiguity can be really politically useful for some people. And that really matters. And placemaking as a term is a big kind of umbrella under which governments, developers, communities, artists, everybody can gather. Great. But of course, a lot of those practices are really different from each other and kind of diametrically opposed to each other as well. And this strategic ambiguity, whilst it could be played with, could also protect some practices at the same time. And so people are coming at placemaking from very different intentions as well. And this question of what is placemaking, a couple of years ago, it really began to bother me. I'd been to a particular placemaking conference, and it was almost like an evangelical experience in the room. Everybody was so positive about placemaking, and it was like this kind of brave new world of designing places. And a lot of people saying, it doesn't matter how we define it, it doesn't matter, it's more important that we go out and do it. I get that. Talking about semantics endlessly is not going to get us doing the action. But it really bothered me, because it's like we're doing stuff with people, we're doing stuff in place. There's something really inherently political about that. There's responsibilities about that. And just to kind of toss a definition of it away seemed really dangerous to me. And so I thought, I'm going to look at this. Who's saying what about placemaking at the moment? And what I thought was just going to be like a blog post, then 2 years after became this series of papers, because so much is being said, and I also found that I wanted to be saying so much more at the same time. So this is a series, Making Meaning of Placemaking. It's a bit of a critical mapping of how placemaking is being defined at the moment, how it's being described and applied across a range of sectors and geographies, institutional settings at the same time. It's not a kind of formal typology in an academic sense, but it's a bit of a kind of a field guide or a field scan to some of the dominant discourses and practices and some of the tensions that are shaping placemaking today. And I start by looking at the global north. It's where the placemaking term started. There's a lot of placemaking noise in America, UK. So I started with that. I then went to notionally the global south, really clunky terms, and I apologise for that. But looking at practices that were coming from a more decolonial standpoint. I then looked at what developers were calling placemaking. I then drilled down a little bit into the UK situation. I know it, it's the place I know the best. I looked at what arts and culture sectors were saying about placemaking. And I kind of came to a point at the end of like, okay, how do we make sense of all of this? And I think I've reached a sense, So this is what I realised were the most sort of common areas that people were talking about or describing, because sometimes you'll find there isn't a definition of placemaking, but there is a description of a practice that would be attributed as placemaking. And these were the sort of current ones that I was finding coming through and sort of objectively looking at as a type of practice. So creative placemaking, that started as a term in 2010, a really seminal paper coming out of the National Endowment for the Arts in the States. And it, as a term, it really took hold. This is a kind of placemaking that's often led by arts and culture. It certainly uses creativity as a catalyst within place across economic identity, belonging lines, whichever it may be. Institutional placemaking is often led by government or local councils, local authorities. I would also put universities, some university practices, in this under this definition as well. And this is a placemaking that's usually framed through a policy or a planning context. And this is something where communities might be consulted, but that might also be at a distance. And certainly the communities wouldn't necessarily feel that they're particularly in control of the conversation or in control of the process. Tactical placemaking, small grassroots interventions, temporary, that could be a day, that could just be a couple of months. This is the kind of the pop-up kind of parklet type of end of the scale of placemaking. But this is often a practice that's kind of done to poke at something, to point an arrow at an issue in place, or kind of making a very visible call for something to happen in a place. Justice-orientated placemaking is something that's in a way fairly new, I want to say. Placemaking is a really young kind of sector or discipline. And a lot of people are turning their attention now to a placemaking that's rooted in activism and reparation and is really talking to a place of equality and spatial justice. And then developmental placemaking, and this is something that sort of 2 years ago was really part of this itch that I had to scratch about what people saying placemaking is. This is led by developers and their investors, and there's a language of placemaking here that on the one hand might be attributed around corporate social responsibility, but it's certainly about regeneration and it's certainly about market value. And these orientations, I'm not necessarily saying that one is good and one is bad, but these are all on this spectrum that I'm seeing in this placemaking sector at the moment. They can sit side by side in the same city. I can think of places where they sit side by side in the same site of placemaking as well. But they clearly don't carry the same intention or the same desire for the same outcomes. They don't carry the same politic. So whilst a justice-orientated practice might fight for a reparative space for a marginalised community, a developer might also use then the term placemaking to market a luxury lifestyle for really expensive flats. But the same word is used, which does a lot to really obscure the conflicts that can sit behind these definitions. And this is where this ambiguity becomes dangerous. It kind of allows placemaking to feel really consensual across these different types, when there's actually really sharp divergences between these practices. And crucially, when placemaking is used and it flattens these different types, it privileges those who already have an institutional or financial power to define the term in their own image. So when I go into working with a community, and in some instances I don't always say that I'm a placemaker. It can get in the way for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is that people think of placemaking now as something that developers do. And it's wrapped up in gentrification and social cleansing. And to me, I don't always recognise that as placemaking. That's why it's really important to define and understand. So that's why it's the playfulness, the openness of this term of placemaking can be really powerful to work with. It can allow us to build coalitions and work in a really interesting cross-sector way and bring together kind of communities of different peoples and skills and expertises that weren't happening before. But this ambiguity can also erase these differences. It can smooth over conflict and it can silence community agency at the same time. So it's not enough actually simply to say, we're doing placemaking. We have to always be asking, what type of placemaking are we doing? Who are we doing it for or with, and what are the consequences of this type of practice that we're doing? I'm going to give you an example of this that I know inside out, and this is from my home city of Brighton in the UK. The street that you see here is called London Road. There's a big indoor market on that one there, and this is various different aspects, 2 different aspects going up and down the road. And it's a very common looking kind of UK high street. It caters to a largely lower socio-economic community. It offers really affordable shopping at various different price points, and there's loads of places along this street for sociability, for gathering without having to spend any money. It's also a really high transit part of the city. Loads of bus routes come here and meet here. And whilst travel in Brighton is more expensive than in London, the fact that, you know, people come from across the city to shop on this road says a lot about the affordability of the shops on this road. And it's accessible, it is easy to get to. To one side of this, there's a park, a really large park that's really well used in the daytime, and is certainly another of those sites of sociability and kind of wraps in around the sense of place of London Road as well. And there's a really strong civic fabric here. There's a number of arts and community development organisations that are situated on this road. There's a local area action team working with businesses and residents to tackle safety on the area and tackle antisocial behaviour. And they're working really hard and making a real difference as well. So you've got London Road here, you've got the park there, and then on the other side, there's this road, which is Elder Place. And that's what Elder Place, in the majority, looks like. It's really dilapidated and run down. It is unsafe pretty much 24/7. And it's kind of just this through road for cars to go past. There's a lot of antisocial behaviour that happens on that place. It's a really difficult part of Brighton's cityscape. It's also home, though, to the brutalist building at the top there, which is called New England House. It's a brutalist multi-storey building, and it was home to over 80 creative businesses and digital startups. And it had been doing that for as long as I've been in Brighton, which is like 35 years. And it was really thriving. It was a place that you could go to as an individual artist and get a studio. You might then join a collaborative and go to a bigger studio. Digital startups there just started with 1 or 2 people, and they've become businesses of 25, 30 people. And it could still house you. It's big enough to, as you grew, it would grow with you kind of thing. And it's also a building that's owned by the City Council. Now, I work all over the place, and I can guarantee you that every place I would go to would want one of these in it if it doesn't happen to have it already. They would be scrambling over themselves to create a place like this. But in Brighton, the council has kicked those tenants out. They've been evicted, the building has been shuttered down, and the site is then next door to this shiny CAD picture here of new flats and development. It's been given a really awful name, like One Brighton or something ridiculous like that. And the flats are majoritively empty. And they have been for a number of years. So that's the other side of London Road. And this is what we have now at the moment. Here's London Road doing its thing. This is a new design. The council have put out a design competition for design and public art interventions on a redesigned Elder Place. So this is that road that we just saw next to it. And lots of people have gone, well, hold on a minute, that's the view looking this way, but so where's New England House? Where's that multi-storey development building? And it's not there, which sends quite a message as to what's going to happen with that. This is real speculative real estate happening right next door to this high street. So the fear is that New England House will be lost entirely to the city, and it will be replaced with those shiny luxury apartments that are going to sit empty. And there's a real knock-on effect to here, and that London Road is in quite a precarious, risky situation here. And the knock-on effect to its own socio-economic community. So we've got two streets here side by side. Both are framed in different ways through the language of placemaking. One is placemaking on London Road as a kind of community solidarity and a placemaking of the vernacular and of the everyday life. And the other is a placemaking, a gentrification, and a speculative development. And this is the danger of ambiguity. The same word describes practices that are really pulling in opposite directions. And again, that's why we must always ask, what kind of placemaking, for whom, with whom, and what are the consequences? But this Brighton story, it also reveals how easily placemaking can be captured by those more powerful interests as well. Developers and funders and governments have learned that placemaking is a good word. It has positive connotations around it. It signals something about community, about belonging, about creativity. And these words carry a real positive weight, and they can be used to legitimize almost anything. So a block of luxury flats, as we've seen, becomes placemaking. A new shopping centre will become placemaking. A piece of street furniture or a mural commissioned by, to an artist without any of that community input will be called placemaking. And this is what I call the semantic capture of placemaking. The appropriation of placemaking's language to justify really quite predetermined outcomes. And this is so far removed from that radical potential of placemaking that the community is the expert in their own lives. The community sits around that placemaking table. And this is when placemaking becomes that term that often is coming from top-down planning. Investment is associated with really managerial frameworks as well. And the effect is to flatten placemaking into a technocratic process, stripping away that radical potential. And this isn't just a rhetorical device either, really. Developers have really captured this term of placemaking. And they've really, it's been used as a gloss for practices that really undermine community life as well. But they kind of got a grip on it as well. And thinking about London Road, the placemaking that's happening there, the markets, the social fabric, the artwork projects that are happening there, it's really fragile. And yet developers can use the same word to describe evicting creative tenants from that building on Elder Place and replacing them with housing that is unaffordable, not just to the residents of London Road, but to 99% of the people across the city. So it's not enough to say we're doing placemaking, or I'm a placemaker even. We have to look beneath this language. Who is speaking? Who benefits? Who's excluded? And if placemaking simply becomes a badge that can be pinned onto any intervention, it is losing its meaning. And worse, it's going to be legitimizing exactly the harms, the dispossession, the inequality, the erasure of certain people in place that it was actually kind of founded in its roots to completely counter. So if placemaking is to mean anything, it has to resist this semantic capture. It has to remain accountable, not to developer, marketing teams or their shareholders or any governmental target as such, but to the people and the communities whose lives are lived in these places. Now there's different examples here of projects across the top in Brooklyn, in Melbourne, in Rotterdam, And then at the bottom in the corner here, there's then Mexico City and in Cape Town. So the examples here, I'm not necessarily, they're kind of emblematic of this. But certainly the examples in Brooklyn, Melbourne, Rotterdam, there's a language of placemaking used as a kind of, there's an aesthetic gloss to these projects. There's a badge pinned onto redevelopment. It's a branding exercise. But then in places like Mexico City, which is in the center there, this is a real grassroots placemaking. We see something really different. So here, placemaking isn't a marketing tool. It's kind of a means of survival. It's a practice and a process that means that neighbours are protecting their market. They're defending their commons. They're holding their memory. They're holding their identity against the erasure. So placemaking is always in this particular tension. On the one side, there's this surface activation. On the other side, there's real deep community voice and community power. So there's another challenge in this and more questions to be asking ourselves. When we hear the word of placemaking, how do we know which one we're dealing with? And if placemaking is so often captured, how can we reclaim it? And for me, there's an answer in this. I've worked in place, but I've also worked through the arts sector my entire life. And I turn to that arts, culture, and heritage field to kind of answer that question of how can we reclaim placemaking. And so here, placemaking in this sector isn't a branding exercise. It's not a design code and a planning application. It's not necessarily just a pop-up activation. It's a real cultural praxis. And by praxis, I mean not just an activity or a project, but it's a way of being and of knowing and doing in the world. And in my research, consistently, actually, but certainly in these pieces in the last 2 years, 3 qualities really stand out that arts and cultural practice bring into placemaking. And that's memory, imagination, and accountability. So with memory, placemaking is a process of holding memory. It works with the stories, the existing identities, the histories that are embedded in a place. Heritage organisations, archives, oral histories, artistic interventions, these all can preserve and surface what might otherwise have been forgotten or excluded. So think of a mural in a neighbourhood that honours its migrant histories. Or it could be a community theatre piece that retells a city's industrial past through the voices of those that lived it. These aren't just aesthetic gestures, though they have that integrity of their own, but they are also acts of care that say this place remembers you and you belong here. And then to imagination. So placemaking opens up futures that don't exist yet. Artists invite us to see our streets, our squares, our parks differently, to imagine new ways of living together as well. So a festival in a disused car park transforms how we might think about ownership and access. A participatory art project that invites residents to dream what their riverfront could be is this act of imagination. And imagination matters because without it, placemaking risks being about only what is, about what we can measure now, about what we can do now, what we can plan or design just now. This kind of cultural practice of the imagination insists we think about what a place could be, and it keeps that future really open. And then on to accountability. And this is really important, and I've talked to some of the students in the room today about this, and it kept coming up so much about this accountability in placemaking. So often the accountability in placemaking kind of goes up. It goes up to the shareholder, or goes up to that, high level of government as well. But bringing in a cultural practice, that cultural lens into this teaches us that there's a different accountability, and there's an accountability to the people that live and work and gather in a place as well. And it's a kind of relational accountability. And it's always asking us, who sets the terms of this value? Who decides what success looks like? Who has a say in this place? And artist and community-led placemaking, it can be assessed in terms of metrics or different metrics, or how many people came to this place compared to before. But it's also valued, it has a different value register here. It looks at relationships that have been made, trust that's been built, solidarity that's formed as well, because it's accountable to that community first. So together, these three qualities, memory, imagination, accountability, they give placemaking a depth and a grounding, and they give it an ethics as well that I would argue isn't necessarily in other forms of placemaking. And they turn placemaking really from a project into a practice of care. They remind us that culture isn't an add-on to any development, anything that's being done in place, but culture is how we live, how we remember, how we belong. And it's kind of those of us that work in the arts, we know this, but we're still having to say this so often. But in this sense, this is, the function kind of thing, or the arts and culture sector often acts as this particular hinge. It mediates between the grassroots and practices of solidarity, and it can also, it mediates between that and the institutional frameworks around us of policy or of development. And working in this hinge is really, really fraught with tension. There's always a risk of being co-opted by a strategic agenda that you could have walked into this situation with the best will in the world, have no idea about, and suddenly you're there confronted with it. But there's also massive potential to be working in this particular space, and that's to broker, to advocate, and to rebalance power as well. And we talked about it earlier as well. That's, for me, I work in this really complex, complicated space. It is fraught with tension. You're constantly negotiating and renegotiating with yourself and others around you. It's really complex work, but it's really necessary work. So then, if placemaking is to mean something, if we're saying that placemaking does have meaning still, we also have to ask, whose placemaking are we actually talking about? Let's get deeper into this, because there's a lot which I've talked about what's present in placemaking so far, and now this is a consideration of what is absent in the placemaking field. The voices, the practices that are overlooked, that are willfully marginalised, that are intentionally erased as well. And particularly in the last sort of 2 years of research that I've been doing on this, there are groups which are really coming through as consistently absent from placemaking discourse, and all sorts of placemaking discourse in this. I say this as well. This is across the board. So disabled-led practices, these are rarely acknowledged as placemaking. Although disabled-led practices, I know, have radically imagined what access, use, and belonging in a public space could look like. Migrant and diasporic communities too, they're often spoken about, certainly in policy worlds, but it's quite a lip service. They're spoken about, but they're not really listened to, even though their cultural practices has for centuries in any city are really central to how those cities actually live and how they function. Queer and trans placemaking is massively under-recognised, despite the fact that LGBTQAI+ communities have long created safe and affirming spaces in really hostile places. Working class placemaking, grounded in labour histories, in a vernacular culture, of high street life, certainly for the UK, is frequently invisible in official narratives. That picture of London Road, if somebody says to me, where should I come and visit in Brighton? I go, yeah, you have to go down to the sea. You have to go and see the Royal Pavilion, and you should go to London Road, because that's what Brighton is really about, is that London Road. You will never, of course, see a high street of nail bars and chicken shops on the front page of our tourism website. It's just not going to happen. That part of Brighton doesn't exist in that kind of narrative. But it's of a really working class culture. And in ecological and non-human logics as well, these are absent from mainstream placemaking language, and that's even in the face of the climate breakdown that we're in right now and what is coming to us. This interdependence of human nature, the non-human, it's just absent from so much of placemaking practice and discourse. And we talked about it before, it's absence from recognising it from a sort of an ethical point of view as much as any kind of material point of view in a lot of cases too. And then trauma-informed approaches, these are missing in a lot of practice, despite the reality that many places and communities within them carry legacies of displacement, of violence, and exclusion that have really shaped how that place is experienced. And there's all sorts of trauma, big T, little t trauma that can come into that. So all of this together, these absences, they're not accidental. We know this, they reflect those systemic biases in how placemaking is funded, how it's evaluated, how it's talked about. Practices that don't fit easily into a particular funding stream or into a particular metric or particular policy framework are simply kind of not recognised as placemaking. And there's a real, epistemic injustice behind this. There's a real active silencing of certain forms of knowledge and practice in place because they don't align with dominant framings of placemaking. And the effect is we end up with a really partial and distorted picture of what happens in place because of it. When placemaking is celebrated, it often looks like a glossy regeneration scheme of lifestyle branding, or it's a flagship cultural project. But what gets overlooked is when it's a food market, when it's a queer bar, when it's a community allotment, or it's a disabled-led intervention or protest in a public space. So if we're serious about this practice of placemaking, and if we're serious about really holding a definition and understanding of placemaking, we have to confront these absences in the practice. Because until we do that, placemaking is going to remain vulnerable to that capture, that semantic capture by those already holding power, while the practices that most need support remain marginalised and remain really precarious. And then that leads to this next question. How might placemaking be re-specified in ways that hold it accountable to those absences, to the people, the practices, the ecologies that are so often overlooked? It's a classic piece of research. I sat down to do this, and of course I just came up with loads more questions that we have to grapple with now going forwards, as a placemaking practice. So far, we've seen that placemaking is everywhere, yet it's also really unclear, even though loads of people are using this term. We've seen that it can be co-opted by really very powerful actors in our society, and that we've seen that it's also a really deep cultural practice rooted in memory, imagination, and accountability. And we've seen that the absences in a place and in placemaking matter just as much as what is present in this practice as well. So there's a question here of what next? How can placemaking be re-specified so that it does mean something again, and it doesn't mean just anything? And I have a few thoughts on that, a few possible responses from that. So one answer to this is placemaking has to move from being a project to being an ethic. So placemaking is often thought about as a project. It's a new square, or it's a temporary installation of something, it's a particular consultation exercise. But of course, projects come to an end, but those places go on and endure. So if placemaking is to matter, it has to be understood as a kind of stewardship, an ongoing responsibility of care, solidarity, and co-creation. Second, justice has to move from the margins to the centre in placemaking. Justice-orientated and decolonial and feminist and queer practices can't be treated as the add-ons or on the edge or the margins of a place practice. They need to shape the core of what we mean by placemaking, directly confronting displacement, inequality, colonial legacies. And this is a space too where those trauma-informed approaches, understanding how trauma is located in place and in the people when they encounter that place. These trauma-informed approaches too should become the mainstream and not the exception to practice. And then placemaking has to be plural, it has to be situated, and it has to be contextual. There's no universal toolkit to placemaking, although some would really want us to move in that direction. So what emerges in a situation, say, in Sao Paulo is not interchangeable with what emerges, say, in a high street in Brighton or a neighbourhood in Brussels. And to insist, as some are, on a kind of one-size-fits-all of doing placemaking, there's a real violence in this to the specificities of culture, history, and memory. And placemaking has to be defined locally by communities and on their own terms. And then placemaking must be held accountable. Not accountable upwards, as I've said, to the developer shareholder or the box ticking of a particular government party, but accountable sideways and downwards at the same time. So it has to be accountable to the people who live, work, and imagine in a place. And accountability here means really listening to people. It means a reciprocity in your relationship. It means quite often a long-term commitment to a community and a place. And it means a shared authorship of what's happening in that place too. This, for me, is about how placemaking can retain that radical potential that was at its roots, that it was really birthed with. Otherwise, it risks that collapse that we're seeing into a vagueness, into it being a place branding exercise, or even worse than that, really becoming complicit in the very harms it claimed to resist or wanted to set out to resist. So there's always this challenge: who defines placemaking, who benefits from it, and to whom is it accountable? And these are kind of questions that I use in my own kind of little checkbox when I go into any sort of placemaking situation or talking about with a new, with a community or with a new particular project that might be happening. So let me come back to where I began with the question, does placemaking mean anything? So placemaking is everywhere. It's invoked as a term by so many different types of people in so many different types of settings. And it will be invoked meaning different things in the same setting as well. We've seen how its ambiguity allows for both creativity and for this semantic capture, and how its language can legitimize really quite difficult, dubious practices, displacement, so on, as much as it can nurture a sense of belonging and a sense of community and a sense of solidarity in a place too. We've seen that there can be a cultural depth to a placemaking practice, the memory, the imagination, the accountability. And we've seen that those political silences often go unrecognized as well. So does placemaking mean anything? And I would argue, yes, it does, but only if we demand that it does. Only if we re-specify it as an ethic of care and of solidarity and of justice. Only if we hold it accountable to the communities, the histories, and the futures that it is claiming to serve. David Harvey, he reminds us in The Right to the City that it's not simply a right to access the resources of a city, but it's the right to be able to change ourselves by changing the city. And we need to turn that on ourselves as placemakers, as people that work in place. This is not, that's the radical promise of placemaking. It's not a branding exercise. It's not a temporary activation necessarily, but it is a practice of becoming of place and of self. And I'll end on this slide. I think I end pretty much every talk I give on this slide because it means a lot to me. I want to ask you as well, what would placemaking look like if it really truly centered belonging in a place? What would it look like if we really listened to the voices that are usually left out? And it's hard work to do that. We've got to put in the work to do it. What if it treated memory not as like heritage marketing of a place, but as a really lived accountability to the place and everything that a place carries within it? And these questions are true of any place that I go to work in, but when I think of Brussels as I've experienced it, these are questions relevant to this city too, a city that I see and have experienced as layered with languages, with identities and histories. These are really urgent questions to be asking. So I'm going to leave you with this invitation, I guess, and that's for you to be holding placemaking to account as well, to refuse that semantic capture and to reclaim it as that radical and creative and inclusive practice of shaping where we live by the people that live there, and in it shaping ourselves as practitioners too, and holding ourselves accountable to this as a particular practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. So there's time for questions, for conversations. So you have one, put up your hand and you will get a mic.
Thank you for this really interesting talk. As a researcher also working in placemaking, I was interested in one of the slides where you were defining placemaking, creative placemaking, institutional placemaking. And it got me thinking, because one of the case studies I was working on in Brussels, it was in the form of temporary urbanism. So a park was being transformed, but in the time until architects and urban planners will make the final decision, it was given to a grassroots initiative who were really centering placemaking on justice and participatory processes with the people, and in the way that it's participant-led and not agenda-led. But then at the end, I mean, right now it's in that process of like really justice-centered placemaking. But even the grassroots initiative that is managing it is saying that at the end, when it gets into the hands of urban planners, it will be gentrified again. So all that process that is justice-centered is gonna be kind of temporary. So my question is, if for placemaking, justice may be in the process, but is the ending always kind of gentrification?
There's something really interesting in that. When I was working in Indianapolis, and this person was talking to somebody who lived in this area, and there's a lot of arts-led development happening there. And they said to me, like, we've never had a good coffee shop here in this part of Indianapolis. Like, why can't I have a good cup of coffee? Why am I different to anybody else? And it was kind of like, yay, gentrification. It's like, yeah, you should be able to have a good cup of coffee, actually. Yeah, absolutely right. If meanwhile use is being done well, the exit point of that is planned, is anticipated, is supported right from the beginning. There's another project which I worked with in Brighton, and it was meanwhile use on a site, development site of a university, and they were there for about 8 years. Now, in 8 years, in a building kind of about this sort of size, they had all sorts of creative businesses going through it, and these businesses were able to really get themselves established. always at the point in this was their business support, their financial support, was the linking them with other spaces, other landlords and things within the cities that they could then move their practice on once this then became, it was a new lecture site. When that's done really well, that really works. That becomes part of the fabric and the ecology of a city. And there's legacies in places there which are kind of like never forgotten. And these practices are kind of hoping to coexist again. But yes, all too often you see, right, okay, it's the end of the month now, you've got to go, we're shutting up shop, and see you back here in 2 years when we've got multi-thousand-pounds flats being built here. And that's why, sort of for me, there's a lot of, I get asked to come in and consult on placemaking, meanwhile projects, and I just won't do it. There's one that I'm working with currently back in my part of the UK where I was born and brought up, in Somerset, where we're working with a group of residents. We formed an art action group, and it is setting kind of like the design team of this new development on the high street in this small market town called Yeovil. This is going to be a 25-year build. Some of the residents I won't be here by the time it's finished, but I want this to be got right, because this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for it to be got right. And we've been really lucky in that we were able to make a case to the council quite early on of just take this approach with us. You've got nothing to lose, but take this approach with us. And the developer has come on board as well. So now we've got this art action team that sit around the design team table meetings with the developer, the architect, the landscape architect, and so on and so forth. And it's looking at what does a high street really want? And the developer was going, well, shops. It's this is a really poor town. It doesn't need more shops. People can't afford more shops. What it does need is a sense of a place where different communities across the Oval who live very separate to each other can gather. So what are we going to do about that? And the Community Art Action Group have also said, actually, we've got a real issue here with our public health. So can we have public health relocated here, please? And that conversation is now happening as well. With those kind of approaches, it can happen. There are enough examples out there now where it can happen. But yes, sometimes I do feel there's a bit of inevitability that this meanwhile use will go in and it creates lovely looking pictures for the shareholders' end of year report, and then it's all done and dusted and forgotten about. There's an example that I shared with the group we had yesterday, and it was in a place in Dublin, and I know that community group, while the site has kind of been flattened and flats have gone up, they've started community organising in a different way, and they've got involved in their local democracy and governance and council procedures as well. So even if that meanwhile project gets replaced by this commercial corporate capitalist thing, there can still be other spin-off on it as well that can still change how the place operates.
Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. Actually, I had a question, which is a little bit response to the previous question. It's a question about agency inside placemaking. Should only the members of the same community engage into such practice? So, is placemaking only for the locals, or can an outsider bring it?
Oh, that's such a good question. If I said only locals can be involved in placemaking, then I would put myself out of a job. So I don't want to say that. Around that placemaking table, there should be people of all sorts of experiences and expertises. And if we're doing it right, they all come in and we play our role. So I can come in as a placemaker with certain knowledges and practices and processes that I've got to help a process along. And I can bring my knowledge and experience of other places to bear on this other place as well. And go, actually, we've got the same problem. Maybe we could try this thing that I saw, or maybe not. Artists in particular, and this is something which I did in my PhD research, I really asked whether does an artist have to be of a place to work in a place? And the answer was no, but. So an artist doesn't have to be of the place, but it does have to have an understanding of a place. So I was working with an artist who was born and brought up on a social housing estate, still lived on a social housing estate in London. And I was working with him, and he was working on some social cleansing that was happening on another side of London. Even though he wasn't from that social housing estate where we were working, he really understood the problems, the issues that community was facing at the time. And it meant that he could be both objective, but also really deeply empathetic with that community at the same time. So that worked to a real benefit as well. But certainly if it's a community, we have, yes, I would want people who are local to that area to be involved in that process. But it doesn't mean to say that other experiences, other expertises can't and shouldn't come into that process either.
So it's kind of like a dynamics between placemaking and place branding. So if you're like a outsider who was called to the community, you like play more role of branding this place, shaping it in some sort of way. But like just the question of the agency, literally, who decided to hire an outsider? Or
oh God, yeah. So I get hives when I go near place branding. It gives me the heebie-jeebies a bit. I don't like it, so it's not something that I tend to do. But I have colleagues who do it very, very well indeed. I often get asked by communities directly to come in. They might have just Googled placemaking, and my name comes up, or another colleague's name comes up, and they just get in touch. There's a couple of projects I'm working on at the moment where I'm just kind of being a bit of a sounding board to some community activists that are really struggling with something. And at some point, we might get some funding that I could actually go and do some work with them. Other times I'm paid by the council, the local council, and that always puts you in a really difficult position because it's like, I'm being paid by the person that you really distrust. So I have to be really honest about where my money comes from and what I'm going to do with what those people tell me, how I'm going to share it and what's going to happen as a result of it. And a lot of other times I'm paid by a funder that's attached maybe to a particular institution, like a museum or a university, and that comes with its own politics for us to negotiate at the same time. I don't think I've ever been paid directly by a community, actually. I wish there was a way that could happen. The money has usually come from something which is a bit more, if not at the top, but certainly in the middle of a place, and it comes with its own particular dynamics. You have to be really transparent. The community won't trust you. The people you're working with won't trust you if you're not. And that has to be a really integral part of your practice.
Okay, thank you. That's why actually I liked very much your slide about grassroots pressure and institutional framework. Very explicit.
It's a really brilliant space to work in. It's exhausting, but it's fascinating at the same time.
Thank you. You mentioned that the funding is often coming from sometimes the top, sometimes somewhere in the middle. I'm wondering, does the institutionality of that funding ever create a limitation on how radical the placemaking actually can be? Like, are there strings around what kind of things you can do with the money? And
yes, absolutely. Different funders, different institutions are different, though. Some will be quite hands-off. Others will really want to get into the detail of something with you. And something I'm finding in the UK is that as money and the sources of money shrink, particularly those funders which are direct from the government, so the Arts Council of the UK gets its funding to give out directly from government. They are getting so much more prescriptive over what you can and can't do. And they're coming into projects more and more and kind of putting a curb around what you're doing, which is leading to, it's still the main source of funding in the arts, but it's leading to a lot of people go, I'm not going to go to them for funding. That isn't a relationship I want to have with a funder. And then you have a project in the UK called Local Motion. 8 of the biggest funders, not the Arts Council, but 8 of the biggest funders in the UK got together and realised we're funding a lot of the same projects in the same place. There must be a way that we can use our money better if we get it together collectively. So they've put a lot of money, that's what they've done, they've put a lot of money into these pilot projects, 8 of them across the UK, and a kind of hands-off way. It's like, you go and work out what matters most to you in this community that you want to address. Come back and tell us at the end what you do, which is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And institutions as well had to work to their own funders, their own patrons, their own particular agendas at the same time. So yes, it will come with, there will always be something that they are asking you to do to meet their goal. There's degrees to which, how prescriptive, how tight that might be, or how interesting that goal might be as well.
It's super loud, no?
No, it's good.
Okay.
Good.
My question is super linked to all the other questions, and I guess it's the same questions you get all the time. Your framework in the beginning, my guess is it's mostly theoretical, and in practice it's often not that categorical, because for me, regeneration, it's not just because you said intentions differ, right? That's the main way of dividing the groups. And for me, developmental and institutional, they often have the same intention of regeneration. So why did you divide it anyway? Because maybe there's other intentions you didn't mention, or...
There's definitely other intentions, but there was a kind of, in an analysis way, there's a kind of thematic coding that I did on what I was seeing, and that's where things were beginning to align. But of course, none of those situations are kind of binary. There's nuances in all of those, and it's not a very technical term, but they're kind of like buckets to hold something in. But they are fluid, and they do cross over, because we are working in a really complex space as well. But that was helping me, that kind of thematic coding was helping me see some of the kind of the main trends that were happening. And actually, when it comes to the point of the institutions, and including universities in this, they can work to kind of, not anti-regeneration, but they're not all working to that kind of agenda either. They're kind of facing in several different directions. That's why I kind of felt that they deserve their own particular kind of classification. And I was also seeing with that in terms of governmental bodies, some very particular ways in which they were understanding placemaking that was really different to developers, that was around transit or housing, or refuse collection even in a city as well. So there's some quite hard and fast distinctions between them, but this is a really fluid area of practice, and there's loads of overlap between them all.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I would like to, it's a bit weird to hear like double. I'd like to add one thought that I developed a few years ago when I was still living in Munich and doing research for my bachelor's thesis. At the time, it was still during COVID. In the city of Munich, there was actually a framework that allowed for very bottom-up placemaking interventions. And what I found out is that a single placemaking intervention is actually part of a plurality of spaces. So for few people, this would be like the nicest place they have ever dreamed of, and like now we can gather and or we can rest because we are old and we need no benches. And for others, they were rejecting it because it was like underneath their bedroom, and they were fearing like, oh, it's going to be too loud, and still others thought it would like attract the drug scene or something. So I was wondering at the time, can like a placemaking intervention, given this plurality, also work as an arena, a forum for some political process? What do you think and feel about this political or even democratic potential that may lay in placemaking interventions? Is this something that you observe that really can happen, or is it like more theoretical thought?
No, it can absolutely happen. I can tell you now, you'll never have a consensus on, the end result of a placemaking process conversation. Nobody will agree on it that it's great. You'll never get that consensus. What's important is the process that gets you to that. People feel that they've been heard, like really meaningfully heard, and had an input into that process. Even if the end outcome, they don't like it, they've participated in a process. So that's why placemaking, there's often a material aspect to it. There's going to be a material change somewhere. But it is a process. To me, more than anything else, it's a process. And it is a really democratic process as well. And for me, it is really anchored in our right to the city, in community voice, into community power. It's about the agency of people to determine where they live, what it looks like, and how it functions. And there's the part of me that holds that as a real ideal, because if I didn't, why am I doing this work anyway? But I do see that play out in all of the projects that I work in. There's an aspect of that, of a real democratic, or not, and a kind of real citizen-led, civic kind of process that's wrapped into this all the time. The UK is going through devolution at the moment, so government powers are being dissolved locally. And suddenly the placemaking field is kind of being turned to, kind of going, well, you can help us have the really necessary conversations we need at a local level that we've never had before in this way, to determine how our budgets for transit or education, for example, are spent. And there's a whole, where it's happening in my particular area, there's a whole list of people and groups that I'm kind of sharing with those democratic powers to say, you need to be working with this person over here, you should be working with that person over there. So for me, at the heart of placemaking is absolutely that kind of political engagement, that political agency at the real citizen level with it, for sure.
Yes, thank you. So you said at some point that it has an ambiguous definition, which I was glad to hear, because in my mind it's also still ambiguous. But then there was a point about the metrics. Is there like a way to evaluate the impact of placemaking on an objective way? Because I think that might also help me as an individual to comprehend things a bit more better.
Yeah, that's an area that placemaking has struggled with a bit. So when I was working in Indianapolis, there was a metric that was put against a placemaking project that suddenly there was loads more mobile phone activity in that area. And they're going, this is great, this means that there's loads more people there. And actually what it meant was at night, it become a real place for drug dealing. But metrics like that were really quite hard and fast applied to it. There was an organisation called Art Place America. It existed for 10 years, and it was only meant to exist for 10 years. But they did a lot around a metric practice of placemaking, how you can measure footfall, increase in spend, all of that kind of thing. I think there's another value register to this, which is much more qualitative, which is looking at the impact on different relationships that might be made or partnerships that might form as part of a placemaking project. There's also increasingly looking at placemaking in terms of public health and well-being, community well-being. There's lots of metrics around placemaking and social prescribing as well that are showing changes in a community's health in that way. it's really important that each project is is measured on its own terms. So if you want to do a placemaking project because you want to revitalise the high street, then you need to look at those figures. Are businesses staying here longer? Are there fewer empty shops? Are there more people coming in on the buses here? If it's actually one which is around community trust, then there's questions of, are we seeing different people in this space right now? Are there different kind of relationships forming in this place as well? This is something which is a really emerging area for placemaking, because quite often I think we went to conventional arts, culture kind of evaluation questions or research questions and applied those, and it doesn't quite fit. And I think there's a bit more of a confidence in the sector to actually determine itself what is being measured by success. In the placemaking handbook there's a whole section at the back of it which is just about evaluation. And I think, and I did an audit, a bit of an audit of sort of common evaluation questions or practices, different indices that are being used at the moment in placemaking. There's over sort of 270 to close to 300 that are in common use at the moment. So I can't give you a yes, measure these 5 things, unfortunately. Each of them has to be on its own terms, but they are there, and actually you can determine how it's going to be measured at the same time. You don't have to stick to any blueprint that's come from anywhere else.
So I have a very financially related question, because I'm wondering, you keep saying it's very important to involve local people and the community, and I feel like there will always be people that have more free time than others, and it's very hard to equally involve everyone. So I'm wondering, like, are there any ways to include everyone? Do you always have to pay people because some can afford the participation more than others? Or what ways are there to actually involve different people from different backgrounds?
You will always get the people there that have a lot of time on their hands and like the sound of their own voice coming along to a project, and I think they can be really useful. It's my job, though, to get out and about in a place and amongst the community to find some of those other community gateways that aren't necessarily always invited into a place like this or don't feel that they're welcome. And I try and do as much as I can to make people feel welcome in that space as well. I think it's too easy to say we have to pay the community for their time. The situation in the UK as well is that if I was to give somebody money who's on benefits, their benefits would be capped the next time round, so why would they turn up to that? I also can't give them cash because I've got to put it through a funder's budget, so I have to have a receipt, and it all just doesn't work. So in the past, we've offered vouchers to people. We always give people food. I will always feed people when they come. Others have said, what you would pay me, would you put that to the food bank? Because I'll get it that way. Or could you give it to that particular charity because I'll get some benefit from it that way at the same time. What's more important is that you really hear what that individual or the community really wants. And what's more important is that you actually set it up as a relationship so it isn't an extractive thing that you're doing. And I know people just say, yeah, we should pay the community for their time. It isn't as simple as that. And some people actually don't want to be paid for their time because they just value that you're being asked. And I always say to them, but there has to be something I give you. There has to be something reciprocal in this as well. I'm finding funders are getting a bit better at this too, and accepting that there will be a budget line to pay people for their time. The expectation that people should just show up because they care about a place and give their opinion to you and their thoughts to you for free is really beginning to go. So I'm finding more flexibility in how I can remunerate or other people for their involvement in a place. And part of giving back is also saying to them, this is what's happened as a result of what you've told me, or hasn't happened, and this is why. So it's the relationship forming in that.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry, I only popped by the last 10 minutes, so I don't know if this has been mentioned before. So I'm wondering, to which extent do you think that placemaking can also inform policy making, or do you think, let's say, you mentioned now multiple times this example of the high street somewhere in the UK. Yeah, to which extent should placemaking also move then, let's say, from this community, from this place, towards, well, policymakers? Should people working on placemaking also aim for, policymaking? Are you doing it? Is this feasible? Is it?
Absolutely, it's really, really important. And as I've gone on and kind of gone into different contexts and things, you see different places where power lie. And the power doesn't necessarily lie with like the leader of the council. It will lie with the planning department, or it will lie with the person who determines how the public health budget is being spent. And placemaking, because it necessarily will talk to education, transit, housing, public health, and all the rest of it in a project, you can have quite a lot of wide influence in that. And absolutely, in the projects that I'm working with, increasingly we're looking to, okay, what can we do, not just in and of itself with this project, but how can we influence policy? How do we have the conversation with policymakers? When do we intervene in the policy-making life cycle? How do we understand what cases they have to make for a policy to be implemented? When does the council meet to vote on this? There's so much detail within that, but increasingly, that is, when you want change to happen, it happens at the policy level. And so I'm finding myself personally, but also a lot of other practices, more explicitly leaning towards that as well. You know, in 5-10 years' time, there might be a kind of policy-led placemaking up in that kind of description of different types of placemaking. But yeah, it's a really big part of what you do working in place, for sure.
Maybe a final question? Or not? I don't know. You might have a final question.
Thank you. A question from somebody who's not informed at all about the topic. Could you give an example of a project you're particularly fond of, happy about? Something that was a challenge but turned out exactly the way you envisioned? A place where you like to come back because you are proud that you've accomplished that? Well, a couple of them during the research.
Yeah, I mentioned them to some of the people today. One is Big Car in Indianapolis, bigcar.org. They were artists that bought up, it's socialist Marxist work, but you would never say that in the States. But they bought up real estate, and they've really set the agenda for the gentrification change in their neighborhood. They are fantastic, absolutely fantastic. I would also mention the project of the Drawing Shed in London as really good socially engaged examples of working. In the UK, there's a scheme called Creative People and Places, and a lot of those programs are absolutely transformational, led from the grassroots of place through an arts-led approach as well. There's a real Heart of Glass. Slow Factory is another really good one as well. There's been a really good project that's come out of Oslo Met, which is working with theatre in placemaking contexts where there was real contention in a place about city policy and development. They've got a really good resource there. If you can't find it on my website, I've got a list of my favourite resources, and that's one of them. It's really, really good. I mean, a list of good placemaking projects is quite long. There's also quite a long list of those that don't work out. And that's kind of fine too. And there are sometimes I go in and I think, I really hope this happens about this project, and it never will. But it kind of doesn't matter because that's just my idea. It's not what comes out of the project itself. The work on London Road that I'm doing is really interesting. So that's like my shopping street. That's my high street as well. That's why I really care about that road. And we're just about to get quite a substantial amount of funding to take an arts, cultural, creative placemaking approach to impacting the policies for that particular road, particularly looking at community and individual health, antisocial behaviour, and the environmental impact on it being such a high bus and car density road at the same time. So that's arts and culture funding we've got to hopefully make real systemic change through taking a placemaking approach. Who knows where that's going to take us, but it's a real step change for that area. So that's one that I'm particularly quite proud of as well. And there's also a project I worked on in Wembley in London, so where the big football stadium is. And I was working with the developer, and I walked into a room at first, and it was loads of old white men, really quite old white men, just going, what's all this about then? And 6 months later, and I walked into them, meeting with them again, they were all around a laptop, and they're, come and look at this, look at this. And these old white men, who were so suspicious of what we were saying, of like, take a cultural approach in your redevelopment of Wembley Stadium, because it's just football. They'd started their own Pinterest of yarn bombing that they'd been gathering, and I was like, oh my God, my work here is done. So things like that, there's always a little sweet spot in a particular project that I'm particularly proud with. And that may not necessarily change the world, but I've gone on to see in Wembley some really, really inspired and quite bold commissioning, and the rehousing of a local theatre in the space as well. And I'm not taking all credit for that, but I just thought I've chipped away at something there. And that's quite often just that little chink, and you never know where it will go.
So on this very positive note, I think we should all thank Cara very much for her inspiring words and on placemaking, and just to how she helped us maybe get a bit of a grasp of what the concept is and isn't. I, for one, hadn't really come across the term, and I think I learned a lot. So thanks a lot, Cara, for tonight. And then before we thank you and leave, I would just like to remind everyone of the participatory approach that Geert mentioned last time, which is putting back all the chairs into the back of the room. So the colorful chairs can go to the back. Valentina will show you where they go. And then the wooden ones come with the tables. We can put them
Can I say one last thing?
Yes.
And I spoke to some of you this afternoon in interviews, and I've just got to say you're asking all the right questions. Your questions were really insightful. They're coming from a really curious, critical, constructive place. And just keep on doing that. It was really, really engaged conversation. And you've asked me questions that I haven't been asked for a long time or at all. So you had me on my toes, but I really appreciated it. And I really thank you for your time in having those conversations with me as well. So thank you very much.